Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 1. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 1. Amongst the many things which happened during this past summer, just in case you didn't notice, was the changing of the Twitter logo. And towards the end of July, Elon Musk decided to switch from that nice little bird to a big ugly X. And when asked why he changed, Mr. Musk said the new logo was to embody the imperfections in us all that make us unique. As you probably know, big business today invests a lot of time, a lot of thought, and a lot of money into creating a suitable logo. They do so because they see it as a valuable marketing tool. A good logo, we are told, can make or break a business. And so that being the case, what sort of logo would you choose for your business if you had one? Well, perhaps more relevant for most of us, what sort of logo would you choose for your church or for your religion? For several centuries, the most common symbol of Christianity and of Christian churches has undoubtedly been the cross. You've seen it on the front of Bibles, you see it on the roof of church buildings, and you even see it on maps to indicate where a church is located. But historians tell us that it's only since the 4th century that the Christian church adopted the cross as its logo, and it certainly wouldn't have done so during the 1st century. I say that because the cross gave a very different impression back then. In 1st century times, it was seen as representing something ghastly, repulsive, brutal, barbaric. It symbolized shame and guilt, agony and abandonment. It symbolized a form of death that was so horrific that it was reserved for the very worst of criminals and the very lowest of society. As Mr. Carson says, an equivalent symbol today would be the mushroom cloud of Hiroshima, or an image of the mass graves at Auschwitz. Such was a sense of horror that was produced by the sound or symbol of the cross in 1st century times. It certainly wasn't considered to be a good marketing tool, that's for sure. And yet it was a cross which occupied centre stage in the preaching and the teaching and the writing of the New Testament apostles. And as Paul comes to explain why, we hear him explain a number of things. And the first of those we see in verse 18, where we're told that the message of the cross reveals our true spiritual state. The message of the cross reveals our true spiritual state. If you were here last week, then you may remember that Paul referred for the first time in verse 17 to a theme that will crop up repeatedly throughout this letter, and that was the subject of wisdom, which in verse 17 was human wisdom, worldly wisdom. He raised the subject in verse 17 because you may remember it was such wisdom that was driving and fueling the partisan spirit and the destructive divisions within the Corinthian church. And having raised the subject, he made the point in verse 17 that worldly wisdom and the Christian gospel, they are not only incompatible, They are actually polar opposites. If I had preached the gospel with words of human wisdom, says Paul in verse 17, the cross of Christ would have been emptied of its power. And far from starting a completely new topic in verse 18, although it's a new paragraph in our Bibles, far from starting a completely new topic, he continues the contrast between, literally translated, a word of wisdom, verse 17, and the word of the cross, verse 18. Worldly wisdom, verse 17, the word of the cross, verse 18. It's a contrast between the eloquence of human worldly wisdom on the one hand and the gospel of a crucified Christ on the other. A gospel which has the death of Jesus Christ upon the cross at its very core, at its very centre. And here is how stark the contrast is. Verse 18, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Archaeologists have discovered some 2nd century graffiti, which hopefully you should be able to see on the screen. And they've discovered this graffiti etched into plasterwork in a building in Rome from the 2nd century. The graffiti features a young man bound down before a figure on a cross, the figure having the head of a donkey. And underneath the graffiti, the caption reads, Aleximanos worships his God. The donkey's head indicates that it was drawn in ridicule of the early Christians, because it was considered ridiculous that someone would even think of worshipping one who had died upon a cross. As Paul says in verse 18, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, deserving of nothing other than ridicule. Greek society in those days prided itself in its learning and its wisdom, its eloquence and its rhetoric. They thought that it was in the eloquent man-made philosophical presentations of their day that the answers to life's big questions were to be found, and therefore to preach a message which had at its very centre a man dying upon a cross was considered utter foolishness. Foolishness. And did you know things haven't changed very much? That is why, have you ever noticed? That is why Christmas is much more attractive to our society than Easter. Have you noticed that? The thought of a little baby being born in the poverty of a Middle Eastern stable is something that even our secular society finds appealing and interesting to some extent. But the thought of a man experiencing the horrors of crucifixion is of no interest and of no appeal whatsoever to our secular society. And for many who would even describe themselves as being religious and possibly even Christian, the thought of a good man, an innocent man, dying on a cross just does not make sense. For many today, the message of the cross continues to be foolishness, just as it was in Paul's day. But did you notice what Paul goes on to say about such people? He says their response to the message of the cross, he says their response reveals something about them. Or they think it reveals something about them as well. Like the people of Paul's day, they think it reveals their intelligence, their sophistication, their philosophical and their cultural advancement. That's what they think it demonstrates. But that is not what Paul says. Instead, he says it reveals that they are perishing. In other words, they're spiritually lost and heading for a lost eternity, and that is demonstrated by their response to the message of the cross. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But, says Paul, to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Do you see the contrast between not only the contrast in response, but do you see the contrast between the two categories of people? The contrast couldn't be greater. The one is perishing. The other is being saved. Please note, they're both in the present tense because the final outcome of both is still future. The one is heading ultimately towards an eternity of condemnation and damnation. The other is heading towards an eternity of security and salvation. And to those who are being saved, says Paul, the message of the cross is the power of God. Please note, it is not only a message about the power of God, it is the power of God. And Paul describes it in that way because those of us who are being saved this morning recognize that it is through the message of the cross that God has intervened in our lives. It is through the message of a crucified Christ that God has stopped us in our tracks, as it were, and rescued us from the eternity of damnation that we were heading towards and put us instead on the pathway to eternal salvation. It is through our hearing and believing of the Christ-centered, cross-centered apostolic gospel that huge transformation has come about in our experience. And consequently, we see the message of the cross as being nothing less than the saving and transforming power of God this morning. Do you see the implications of what Paul has said in this verse? Far from merely being the mantra of a few extreme eccentric people on the fringe of either first century or 21st century society, far from that, the message of a crucified Christ is central to the whole course of human history. It is so central that it is this message which ultimately divides humanity into two categories this morning. If you had been asked, what is the ultimate division? What is the ultimate dividing line in our world today? What would you have said? Would you have described it as the rich-poor divide? The haves and the have-nots? The educated and the uneducated? Would you have said that what ultimately divides our world's population today is race or colour or culture? According to Paul in verse 18, it's none of those things. What ultimately divides our world? What ultimately divides our society? And dare I say, what ultimately divides this congregation this morning is the message of the cross. Within every community of people, you will find those who see it as foolishness, and you'll find those who see it and consider it to be the power of God. And the question you need to consider this morning is simply this: what side of that divide are you on? What side of that divide are you on? There's no more important, there's no more urgent question you could think about this morning, for the simple reason that the answer to that question reveals your true spiritual state. Please note, it's not turning up in church on a Sunday morning that reveals your true spiritual state. It's your response to the message of the cross. Those of us who consider it to be foolishness or meaningless or nothing more than a terrible waste of a good life are amongst those, says Paul, who are perishing this morning. While those of us who consider it and have experienced it to be the very power of God are amongst those who are being saved this morning. The message of the cross and our response to it, our estimation of it, reveals our true spiritual state. That's how serious it is. Secondly, Paul goes on to say, verses 19 to 21, he goes on to say that the message of the cross exposes the folly of this world. The message of the cross exposes the folly of this world. Now, having explained how the message of a crucified Christ divides humanity, Paul goes on to explain why this message is foolishness to so many people, and he does so by quoting from the Old Testament book of Isaiah, chapter 29, verse 14, where the Lord says through the prophet, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate." Now, it is important to note that this quotation is not a declaration of war by God on all forms of education or learning or intelligence, and if you've come recently to study at Bangor University, you'll be glad to hear that. Neither God nor Paul were opposed to learning. It is because we live in a divinely created and divinely ordered universe that we can learn. And it is believing that has resulted in Christians often being at the forefront of education and academic excellence over the centuries. Many of our universities in the world were established by Christian people. But the context of Isaiah 29 indicates that what God is opposed to is a quest for knowledge and wisdom which is undertaken in deliberate ignorance of God and often in opposition to God. What God is opposed to is the intellectual pursuit which is out to prove that God does not exist, and the intellectual arrogance which says that even if he does exist, we don't need him. We don't need to take him into account in our search to find out the big answers to life. We can get on and do that ourselves. And God's response to a humanistic, godless pursuit of knowledge of that nature is that he will frustrate it. And that is why almost a century after God spoke through the prophet Isaiah, Paul is able to ask in verse 20, "Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world?" And by the time we get to verse 21, we hear Paul explain how God has done that. "For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him." The only way we can ever come to know anything about God is through God revealing himself to us. It is through God making himself known. And the great news this morning is that is precisely what God has done. He has revealed his existence. He's revealed something of his character in his creation of this universe. But man, in his supposedly superior wisdom, rejects what God has revealed, pursues his autonomous, independent search for truth, and consequently ends up no further forward after centuries of academic research. Have you noticed that? Although we have learnt so much, and especially in the last century, although we have learnt so much about the hows of life on this planet, for example, how does the human body work? How does the ecosystems of our planet function? How do atoms combine to form molecules, and how can they be split to create energy? Although we have learned so much, and we're not underestimating any of that because we benefit enormously from it this morning, but although we have learned so much about the hows of life on this planet, we are not one bit further forward in answering the whys. Why are we here in the first place? When it comes to the big questions of life, you know what those are? Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? And perhaps most important of all, where are we going? When it comes to those big questions, man is no further forward in his search for the truth, and perhaps more confused than ever before. And until we humble ourselves and look for the answers to such questions in the truth that God has revealed in his creation, in his word, and supremely in his Son, until we humble ourselves and look for the truth where God has revealed it, we will remain forever confused. For the simple reason, verse 19, God is frustrating the intelligence of the intelligent. God has made foolish the wisdom of this world, verse 20. That is why, verse 21, this world through its wisdom does not know God and never will. And what has exposed the foolish limitations of this world even more is that what man in his wisdom does not and cannot know, God has made known through the supposedly foolish, ridiculous message of the cross. Is that not what Paul is saying in verse 21? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached. And what was preached, surely in the context of verse 18, it's the message of the cross. God was pleased through the message of the cross to save those who believe. In addition to asking over the centuries, is there a God? Man has been asking a closely related question at times, and that is, if there is, how can we know him? How can we have a relationship with him? How can we be in the right with him? And it is in our attempts to answer those questions that we have invented all sorts of spiritual ideas and all sorts of religious formulations, all of which have been to no avail whatsoever. And yet what we could never know through our own independent search for the truth concerning a relationship with God, what we could never know, God has revealed through the apparent foolishness of the message that Paul and the other apostles have preached, and that is the message of the cross. It is in the gospel of a crucified Jesus that we learn the answer to the questions that has been asked for thousands of years, and that is, how can a man be righteous before God? How can a man be in the right with God? It is in the message of the cross that we learn the answer to that most important of all questions. Because in the message of the cross, and if you have never understood it, then please note, this is what you need to hear, and this is what you need to try and grasp this morning. In the message of the cross, we discover that it is God who has taken the initiative, not us. It is God who has taken the initiative in order to make men and women right with himself. In the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, God has provided a substitute, as we sang in that earlier hymn, who in his death upon the cross has taken the punishment from God that I deserved for my sins. My sin has been accredited to Jesus' account, and he's paid the penalty and the punishment for it at the cross. And through trusting in what Jesus has done, the perfect righteousness of Jesus is credited to my account, and that is how I can get right with God. That is how I can come to know God. Although the world through its wisdom did not know God, God was pleased through the proclamation of a message that the world considers nonsense and foolish. God was pleased through the proclamation of that message to save guilty and condemned and hell-bound sinners like you and me. And if you believe this supposedly foolish message of the cross this morning, and if you put your trust in that one who died upon it, then you too will be saved, rescued from the power and the penalty and the punishment of your sin. And by continuing to have such a powerful saving effect in the lives of men and women, the message of the cross continues to expose the folly of this world. In that this world, in all its supposed wisdom and power, this world has never been able to put anyone right with God. But the message of a crucified Christ does just that. The message of the cross exposes the folly and the emptiness of this world. Thirdly, finally, verses 22 to 25, the message of the cross proclaims the power and wisdom of God. Now, having referred in verse 18 to those who are perishing, Paul now divides the perishing of this world into two subdivisions in verse 22, those being Jews and Greeks, i.e. Jews and Gentiles. That was the great national, cultural, historical divide in first century times. And he explains why people from each of those categories reject the message of the cross. Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. As you read through the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, you discover that the Jews of Jesus' day were continually asking him to perform miraculous signs of one kind or another. And the reason they did so on many occasions because they were demanding that he substantiate his claims to be the Messiah, to be the Christ. They were expecting a Messiah whose coming into this world would be accompanied by great demonstrations of divine power and strength. And so, not surprisingly, verse 23, the apostolic message of a crucified Christ was a real stumbling block to them. In spite of all that their Old Testament scriptures had taught, and especially the prophet Isaiah, as we discovered earlier in the service, the idea of a suffering Messiah, that was one that they just could not get their head around. And what is more, what even made it worse, is that their Old Testament scriptures taught in Deuteronomy 21, verse 23, that anyone hung on a tree was under God's curse. And so the idea of a crucified Messiah was an anathema to the Jews of Jesus' day and to the Jews of Paul's day. To them, Christ crucified. To them, Messiah crucified was a contradiction in terms, and consequently they rejected the apostolic gospel. The Gentiles, on the other hand, they were looking for wisdom. And consequently, they dismissed the apostolic message of the cross because to them it represented anything but wisdom. Because crucifixion was reserved for the very worst of criminals, a cross represented shame because of terrible crimes committed. And when told that Jesus died upon a cross as an innocent man, that made it all the more ridiculous. Because to them, the crucifixion of an innocent man was nothing other than the meaningless waste of a good life, a complete miscarriage of justice, and therefore the epitome of error and foolishness. And so if Jews found it to be a stumbling block, and Gentiles dismissed it as foolishness, who on earth was ever going to believe it? Who was ever going to believe the message of a Christ crucified? Well, left to ourselves, none of us would believe it. I hope you believe that this morning. Left to ourselves, none of us would believe it because it just does not make sense. Unless, that is, God opens our minds and our hearts to understand what was taking place at the cross. And he enables us to believe it. Is that not what Paul says in verse 23 and verse 24? We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Did you hear that? To those whom God has called. Please note, it is God who takes the initiative and calls people to himself. And in bringing them to himself, he opens their minds to see that rather than a demonstration of sheer impotence or utter folly, the death of Jesus Christ upon the cross is a demonstration of divine power. It is a demonstration of divine wisdom, the greatest demonstration of power and wisdom this world has ever seen. That is why Paul can go on to say in verse 25 that the foolishness of God is wiser than man's strength. And you're thinking, hang on a minute, Paul. Have you got your theology a little bit askew here? Where's your doctrine of God? The foolishness of God? Where did you learn that, Paul? No, Paul is simply saying that the foolishness of God is wiser than man's strength because in his apparent foolishness, as demonstrated at the cross, as far as this world's concerned, utter foolishness, in his apparent foolishness, as demonstrated at the cross, God has accomplished something that man in all his wisdom never has and never will accomplish. And that is the reconciliation of guilty sinners with a holy God. And at the same time, the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength because in his apparent weakness, as demonstrated at the cross, God has accomplished something that man in all his power and pomp and prestige has never accomplished, and that is the eternal salvation of hell-bound sinners like you and me. And so rather than being a message of weakness or foolishness, the Christian gospel is a message that declares a power and a wisdom, the likes of which this world has never seen and never known. Oh yes, our world leaders, our political leaders, they can stand up and they can commit billions to this project and that project, to this scheme and that scheme, and their words sound so powerful. Our leading academics can speak on the media about this theory and that philosophy, and it all sounds so clever. But what neither our politicians nor our academics can do is tell us how we can be prepared to meet our Maker. And at the end of the day, is that not the big question? How can we be prepared to meet our Maker? That is the one question that they cannot answer. But what they cannot tell us, the message of the cross does tell us. And so that being the case, let us as Christian people, let us never be ashamed of the cross. Don't forget, this letter was written to Christians. Christians who were being tempted to imbibe the wisdom of this world. Christians who were being tempted to think and act according to this world's wisdom and this world's values. That's what was causing so much division amongst them in Corinth. And what Paul has sought to show them and sought to show us from these verses is that this world's wisdom is not only a futile exercise when it comes to the big questions of life. This world's wisdom is also at complete odds with biblical Christianity, which has at its very core the message of a crucified Christ. And what they and us many years later need to realize and realize afresh is that it is the message of a crucified Christ that has changed and transformed both our spiritual state and our eternal destiny. And therefore, in view of the fact that that message is the message which has saved us and continues to save us and will ultimately save us, in view of that, why would we ever trade that in for the paltry power and the meagre wisdom of this world? Why would we do so when it is the message of a crucified Christ which proclaims true wisdom and real power? Why would we allow the selfish, self-centered, self-seeking wisdom of this world to govern our actions and our attitudes within the church, when it is at the cross that we see what true wisdom and true power really looks like? And so, that being the case, surely we ought to allow the selfless, self-giving wisdom of God as seen at the cross. Surely we ought to allow that wisdom to mold and shape our attitudes and our actions and our lives. Three things concerning the message of the cross. Firstly, the message of the cross reveals our true spiritual state. The message of the cross exposes the folly of this world. The message of the cross proclaims the power and the wisdom of God.